I want to start by expressing my gratitude for and respect for the MFRR, a Media Freedom Rapid Response Group, which is 6 organizations which are working to be able to quickly respond to bad things which may happen to journalists and journalism in the European Union. I'd like to thank them for the work that they've done on this report, which is very fair and and it covers most of the ground. I just want to say that I participate in meetings of the EU Advocacy Group, and I admire the commitment and the of the people who and the expertise of the people who participate in that. I think the world would be a worse place without them and the work that they do. It really is fantastic, and thanks for this and for this report. The problem is that here in Poland, Kaczyński will not change. I mean, whatever we do and however many statements we make and how many recommendations we make, he will not change, and he will probably go down with the ship when it does go down. And all we can do is try to minimize the damage that he and his people are doing to the media and to media freedom. And what is important, I think, as much as protesting and as a part as watching what they do, is to prepare for the future after they've gone, and they will go. The one thing I wanted to say is that we have to educate our politicians. We have to educate all our politicians, not just the peace politicians. I suppose the word re-educate comes to mind, but that doesn't sound very well. So we have to educate all our politicians, but also the opposition politicians. They still seem to think that they divide journalists into their journalists and our journalists. I think that they really have to learn that really journalists are independent, are impartial, should be independent, and that is the way for a normal society. Vera Jourova in the European Commission does understand that, but many of the politicians still don't, and that they don't understand that we need impartial, accurate journalism if we are going to have normal democratic societies. Timothy Snyder, who seems to have written very many books about all this, said on Polish TV the other day that what we need is truth and we need facts, and that is easier said than done. But I think it's a program which I think we should stick to. In Poland also, we need to work on a model of the public service media in the future. That's the non-commercial media. The whole concept is being destroyed at the moment, and it really will have to be rebuilt. But I don't think we have a consensus on this, and we do have to have a consensus about what the public service news media will be in the future. And also, we've discovered, and I think this is, we've discovered that with this business about Polska Press being bought out by a state company in Poland, and the threat that all these newspapers will now become propaganda outlets for the government. What we have also, I've come to understand, looking at the whole issue of local media and local and regional media, is that we need good journalism there, and we've not really had it for a long time. This is about 14 million people out of our 38 million people, and very many of them vote, and they need good information. They need accurate information. And I think that's something that we should start thinking about now and working on now. And that means that the local media, especially in the countryside and the small towns, need special treatment, special support. That includes financial support, but also education. People going to school in these places will need to be educated to recognize false news. So those are the 3 things that I think we should be working on in Poland. And thank you again for the report. And I move to introduce our speakers. Maybe when I say your name, oh no, we have your names on the screen, so that's fine. We have Scott Griffen, who's the Deputy Director of the International Press Institute, or IPI, which is a very powerful and big organization. We have Dominika and reliable, and the same can be said of Dominika Bychawska from the Helsinki Foundation, which is really extraordinarily competent in what they do. I mean, you have no idea how good they are, and they always are they are doing what they need to do and what needs to be done, and they are a fantastic source of information. We have Mr. Głowacki, Witold Głowacki, who's an editor at Polska Times, which is one of the newspapers which is being taken over at the moment by the state sector company Orlen. And I hope he will be able to share some of his predictions about the future of those newspapers. That's 20 regional newspapers in Poland, and well, actually about 15 million users of the websites that these newspapers have. We have Joanna Szymanska, who is a senior program officer at Article 19 and covers most of the world apart from Western Europe, I think. And
no, we also cover Western Europe. Yes.
Also, but you don't cover Western Europe. You cover Western.
I cover Central and Eastern Europe.
Yes, but Eastern Europe goes out to Kamchatka, doesn't it? Somewhere very, very far away. So she has an enormous amount of work. We have Jamie Wiseman from the IPI, who wrote the report, which I read last night, and really I'm very impressed. It's a very, very good piece of work. And Lawrence Hueting from the Leipzig European Center for Press and Media Freedom, whose charter I read last night, and it really covers everything. And I wish you all the best in trying to fulfill the terms of that charter. So let's start with Scott Griffin, who'll tell us about the report, I suppose. Each speaker has about 5 to 8 minutes. I think we know that, don't we?
Yes, thanks a lot, Krzysztof, and good morning to everybody. As you said, I'm Scott Griffin, Deputy Director of the International Press Institute, and IPI organized the mission together with the other MFRR partners. I just want to begin from our side. I'm just going to sort of give our key findings from the report, but I really think that we need to stress today that with this report and with this launch today, we're really sounding the alarm. That this is a really serious moment for press freedom, for free expression, not just in Poland, but in Europe in general. Because what we're seeing in Poland now is the spread of methods that have been used, in particular in Hungary over the past decade, to repress and to dismantle media freedom. And without the traditional methods of jailing journalists or forcibly closing media outlets, we see a new method of media capture, which is about co-opting, the state-led co-opting of the media landscape and the media market. And what we're seeing in Poland, there are so many parallels to what has happened in Hungary. And we've seen that the EU has been unable to stop that development. And that has helped lead us to the situation right now where we see press freedom really on a precipice in Poland, and that's what this report shows. And we decided to carry out this mission early last fall, in response to increased talk about so-called repolonization and deconcentration efforts in Poland, which I'll mention briefly in a minute. And since that mission, where we met with over a dozen editors, journalists, human rights activists, foreign diplomats, we've seen the situation only worsen now. In particular, with the purchase of Polska Press, and even more recently with this advertising tax. This is a really serious moment, as I said, and this report really shows the depth of what we are facing. And I think the need to deal with these issues now, because it's only going to get worse. This model is spreading these different ways of repressing the media while allowing for sort of plausible deniability, if you want, from the state, is getting stronger. And now is really the time to act before it gets worse. So let me go ahead and having sort of given this sort of dire warning, which I think we really need to have in mind right now, let me go ahead and just sketch some of the key findings for this report, and then the other speakers will go into more detail about that. So basically, in general, we see that media freedom in Poland is facing its biggest set of challenges since 2015. And even though we do recognize that Poland's media landscape is still highly pluralistic and still enjoys high levels of free expression in general, But 5 years of policies under the peace government have taken their toll and are destabilizing and weakening independent media. And as I mentioned, the centerpiece of this are these efforts to repolonize and deconcentrate the media market. I think what is the core message here is that while these are ostensibly aimed at increasing media pluralism, in fact, there's something completely different. It's about concentrating the media under the control of the ruling party, and it poses a huge threat to media freedom and also comes into conflict with EU laws. What we've seen is that the government has had problems for different reasons actually bringing a bill to deconcentrate or repolarize the media. But what we see now is that they're relying on alternative methods, alternative ways of achieving these same aims. And we saw a perfect example of this with the takeover of Polska Press by a state-controlled energy company, which gives, in our view, the Peace Party effective control over 20 of Poland's 24 regional newspapers. And one reason why this is so disturbing is because, again, it follows the pattern set by Hungary and by the Orbán regime, which has very successfully dismantled media freedom. And the takeover of Polska Press is a sign that things are very clearly headed in this direction. So we're seeing the engineering of a state-led takeover of the media in this vein of repolarization and deconcentration, even without laws actually being passed in this direction. So and it's not just the ownership takeover. We see a number of other methods that are aimed at destabilizing and undermining independent media in Poland. This ranges from anti-monopoly investigations or in general state control over regulatory bodies that are then used to weaken the market position of media. So control over licensing, blocking mergers of independent media to weaken them, the use of tax penalties and fines. So all of this, or as we've seen, also control over printing presses and newsstands. So the infrastructure of the media landscape, control over all of this is being used to weaken the ability of the independent media to have an impact and to reach their audiences. As I said, this closely mirrors the tactics of the Orbán government in Hungary, which is why we should all be very concerned. One concrete example here is the use of state resources to starve independent media of revenue, for example, through the manipulation of state advertising or advertising from state-owned companies. We see significant discrepancies here, and this is being used not only to punish independent media, but also to prop up elements of this pro-government, this growing pro-government media empire, if you want. Another big finding that comes out of our report is the continued legal harassment of independent media and independent journalists in Poland. We see that journalists are facing an avalanche of costly and time-consuming court battles, both in civil and criminal court, some of which are brought directly by peace officials, others by their allies. And this has a huge draining effect on journalists and media organizations. Some of these can be classified as strategic lawsuits against public participation. My colleagues will go more into detail on that. In general, we also see that journalists in Poland are working in a hyper-polarized society. We see increasing threats and insults to journalists online in particular, which is being fueled by the rhetoric and statements by political leaders. Another chunk of our report looks at discrimination that independent media faces when it comes to access to information. We see that public officials connected to the ruling party are routinely refusing communication or interviews with certain media. Reporters are being denied access to legally guaranteed or publicly held information without explanation. And another issue is increased risk of violence. This is something that actually cropped up more toward the end of last year. In general, physical attacks are rare, but we did see increased violence against journalists covering protests over the last few months. So I think that the overall message here is that these developments, everything that this report shows, is an effort by the PiS government to fundamentally recalibrate and restructure the Polish media market and the Polish media landscape in its favor. It's about overhauling the system in order to be able to control the media, to destabilize and weaken the influence of critical media. So, you know, as I said and emphasize this again, we see a lot of similarities with the Hungarian system, and it's really astonishing that the EU has not done more to intervene and to stop these methods before they're able to take root. So that's sort of our general message. Those are our biggest concerns. And I'm going to turn it over now to other colleagues from other organizations who will pick up on some of these issues and talk about them in more detail. Thanks so much.
Okay, Scott, thank you very much. I'd just like to say to welcome Magdalena Adamowicz from the European Parliament, who's just joined us, and I think she can say a little bit more about how the EU is reacting to the situation. I mean, that she will be speaking towards the end.
Hello, good morning.
Oh,
Good
sorry?
morning, everyone. Hello.
There's I can't hear
Good
you.
morning, everyone. Hello, I'm waiting for my...
You're waiting. Okay, good.
You can hear me.
Fine. There's something. Oh, it's fine. It'll be okay. I just wanted to add maybe to what Scott said, that the takeover of Polska Press, the local media. I think that's something that the authorities are planning, because we have local government elections in 2023. That seems a long time ago, a long time ahead, but actually, I think they want to get the local elections right and they want to win them. They didn't do so well in the last local elections, and that they want those papers to influence the electorate, the rural and the small town electorate. Also, the business about law, what the government is doing and has been doing for the last 5 years has actually been breaking Polish laws about impartiality, etc., etc. The courts, the Polish courts, which are behaving very well, I think, but they're not actually getting themselves around this. And so maybe we could, this issue of whether especially the public service media, whether they are breaking the law or not. And so I come to Dominika Bychawska, who maybe she could comment on that and then say what she's planning to say anyway. Please, Dominika.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you, first of all, for the wonderful report of the Media Freedom Rapid Response Group, very needed in our current situation. I would like to comment, I'm a lawyer myself, working since 2008 on media freedom issues in Poland, so I would like to comment on the legal harassment that has been occurring around media and independent newspapers and media outlets. I think in general, we can classify that we have two main ways of legal harassment. The first one is starting criminal defamation proceedings against journalists, editors-in-chief, and generally independent media. And the second one is starting civil defamation cases. And we have observed the rise in those kind of proceedings that are started by governmental officials, politicians, or people generally related to the ruling party. And to give you an example, it is also quoted in the report, is the fact that Gazeta Wyborcza, being the main criticizer of the ruling party, has now over 50 legal proceedings which involved governmental officials or allies of the ruling party. Starting those proceedings aim at shifting the work of journalists in order for them to work to defend themselves in courts instead of pursuing their daily work. And just to give you a few statistics, since 2015, the case of conviction based on Article 212 of our penal code, so criminal defamation, has almost doubled up until 2018. So that's a substantial rise in those kind of proceedings, and Poland is regularly criticized by the European Court of Human Rights for opening these kind of proceedings and for convicting journalists based on the criminal defamation. Another raise that we have seen recently is the question of civil defamation. So the potential breach of personal good, reputation of people related to the power, but also from state entities. Also ministries, which is very dubious to what extent we can talk about reputation in that cases, and whether this does not interfere even more with freedom of expression standards and the fact that those bodies should be criticized in a wider extent than any other bodies. And what is going hand in hand with civil defamation cases is very broad injunctions that are being sought by officials. So those injunctions usually aim at blocking the information, not allowing to pursue a certain topic and to inform further about a certain topic. And here I must stress that the most important in those cases is the approach of courts, and we have seen very good decision. And I'm thinking about the case concerning Polityka and Mr. Grzegorz Rzeczkowski, a journalist that has been working on prosecutors and the independence, or rather the dependence of prosecutors of our Ministry of Justice, where the injunction of the seek by the prosecutors was extremely broad, basically aiming at stopping him for writing anything about those prosecutors and taking down the information from the newspaper webpage. And luckily here the court said that this kind of broad injunction would mean that the information would never reach, and deciding on such and granting such a wide injunction would mean that basically we already decide on the merits of the case and say that the personal goods in that situation were violated. So here we come to the fact that until we have free courts, and as you know, they are being undermined more and more by different and various reforms pursued by the ruling parties, we will have freedom of expression protected. But as we observe and see, the decisions of the courts may vary a lot depending on the judge, and the nomination of the judge in the last 3-4 years, obviously by a judiciary council which is related to the ruling party, may have an influence on the way he's adjudicating in freedom of expression cases. If you combine it with the lack of independence of regulatory bodies, that's also provokes that we are not always facing a fair and independent decision in freedom of expression cases.
Okay. Thank you. You didn't really answer my question about why the Polish courts aren't implement or making sure that the law on impartial coverage of current events is being implemented, but maybe we could leave that for the questions. Can I move now to Joanna, who also does SLAP stuff and defamation, along with our Society of Journalists, and we're doing a list, which I think we're almost at the end of the work on the list. But we have found there are two problems, and maybe you will agree with me or not. And many media organizations don't want to reveal that they have problems with defamation cases. Partly because lawyers say, don't publicize this, because if we publicize it, it will become an issue and be more difficult for the court to judge, to adjudicate for us. Secondly, I think they're worried about advertisers getting the impression that this is a controversial medium and that advertisers will get scared. We seem to find out about cases, defamation cases, from lawyers, from friendly lawyers who meet other lawyers who are just meeting in court, and they're saying, oh, but you're covering this case and we're covering this case, and we know that there are more than meets the eye. Anyway, Joanna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Krzysztof. Good morning, everyone. So yes, what you mentioned, that's true, and I think these are issues that now everyone monitoring and looking into SLAP cases struggle with, and I think that the full scale of the problem of SLAPs in Poland, so this strategic litigation against public participation, is yet unknown, also because not all media outlets agree to share details of lawsuits brought against them. Yes, apparently this is often the strategy of lawyers. It is also difficult to measure the problem at a local level, as we usually hear about big media outlets most of the time. But luckily this is changing. Media and journalists are getting more and more aware of the support they can get by turning to human rights organizations. Some organizations, including European ones, offer financial support which can cover some of the legal costs, but this of course cannot be a response to the problem. What we need is a systemic change, and that's why I would just like to briefly mention the model of the EU Anti-Slav Directive, which is supposed to protect journalists from such legal harassment in the future. So in December, over 60 human rights organizations proposed a model EU Anti-Slav Directive, and we are asking the EU to adopt an Anti-Slav Directive in line with the commitments the European Commission has made under the European Democracy Action Plan, which was launched in December 2020. In which they have undertaken to present an initiative to protect journalists and civil society against SLAPs. And the model EU anti-SLAP legislation proposes a set of rules which, if in place, would make sure that in each EU country, SLAPs are dismissed at an early stage of proceedings, SLAP litigants pay for abusing the law and the courts, and SLAP targets are given means and assistance to defend themselves. Thanks to the growing interest at the EU level to address this issue, media freedom organizations have more and more information about SLAPs. There are researchers who focus on collecting these cases. I know also that Society of Journalists is doing this. Obviously, Helsinki Foundation have been doing this for years, but there are now even more actors looking into that. And yeah, SLAP lawsuits are a big problem in Poland. I can give some examples, although they've been already mentioned as well. The fact that Gazeta Wyborcza has received over 50 legal threats since 2015. Including civil defamation actions and alleged infringement of personal interest by a number of actors, including Jarosław Kaczyński, the public television broadcaster Telewizja Polska, and state-owned companies. And these include, for example, coverage of recent reprivatization scandal in Warsaw, the quality of COVID-19 face masks brought from China, even alleged censorship of a music festival or a business relationship between Kaczynski and an Austrian businessman in relation to the construction of a skyscraper for a company associated with the ruling party. But Gazeta Wyborcza is not the only target. We know about slap cases against other media outlets such as Politica, Onet, Oko Press. And again, it's not 1 or 2 cases, it's 5, it's 10 cases or more against just one media outlet at the same time. And again, they are mostly brought either by ruling party politicians, officials, or state-owned companies, which have huge resources, including taxpayers' money. And they all have one aim: to have this chilling effect on freedom of expression and to drain financial resources of media companies and journalists. One of the journalists told me that his publisher have already spent 20,000 euros for legal support for lawyers to defend journalists in several slap cases, and the cases are still ongoing, so the cost will still grow. So for me, it is quite clear that slaps are one of the tactics of the ruling party to get rid of independent media in Poland.
Okay, thank you very much. And it has to be said that they will get away with it as long as if the courts come under political control entirely. So that's why the independence of the courts is absolutely crucial. Thank you very much. Can I just move now and ask Magdalena Adamowicz to talk to us, because she's asked to jump ahead of the queue. Could Mrs. Adamowicz, are you there? Hello.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Fantastic. The question is really, is the EU doing enough?
Well, yes, I will try to answer this question at the beginning. Let me say good morning to everybody, and I'm very glad to see you all. I would like to thank for the invitation me today to the presentation of your mission report, and above all for the report itself. It could not have been more timely. So as I spoke yesterday in a parliament in Poland yesterday, a war has raged over the media freedom. Please let me be very clear. It is a war over whether Polish citizens can know the truth, or whether the authorities can decide what the truth should be. So while lying that it is about higher taxes, what the Polish authorities are really after is greater obedience on the part of citizens, because the Polish government wants to cultivate obedience among citizens by means of media that are subordinate to the state, just like in Hungary, just like in Russia. Independent media in Poland is under the deadly attack. I think yesterday's protest, no one anymore can have a single doubt about it. So let me repeat what I said again yesterday in the European Parliament to the European Commission Vice President Vera Jourova, to the presidency of the Council of the EU, and to my fellow members of the European Parliament. There is a limit beyond which helplessness becomes humiliation. Humiliation for those who defend freedom and democracy in solitude. So as the Latin maxim says, vim vi repellere licet, force may be repelled by force. Force adequate to the threat. Therefore, as the European community, we have to take adequate action. But also all free media around the world need to show solidarity with Polish free media, because of it happened to us, it can happen to you as well. Allow me to thank you for your solidarity with Polish independent media and journalists. But your report is certainly a bitter chunk of information to swallow. It presents, though, a very realistic account of the dramatic situation. Even more so, as we are all aware, the situation has already considerably aggravated since the time emission took place. Yesterday's silence in all Polish free media has been a protest. It has been a warning. If we do not react now with action, this moment of silence may become soon a minute of silence. Silent under the coffin of Polish democracy and those of European democracy. So, today we are witnessing of the annulment of the democracy, a vote cast out of hate, lack of information, or on the basis of that disinformation, even if it's truly counted, will never be a democratic choice. It is at the best a formal caricature of it. So you talk extensively about the so-called repolonization of Polish media, which in fact is the takeover of private media by the state-run companies. It is simply the nationalization of the media. Such concentration of the ownership represent a major threat to the organization of a free and fair elections. So, as you mentioned, our presidential election in 2002 and the report of OSCE that has reported that the fairness of this election was merged by the lack of impartiality in the public media. This is extremely something that works. So, media dependent on political power are not by definition independent. Those they do not play the role as safeguards of democracy, but on the contrary, became a huge threat to it. The media should serve the truth, not lies, and they are to serve voters, not the elected. So their purpose is to control power, not to maintain it. Well, therefore, for this, the media must be independent. So for this reason, from the very beginning of my term in European Parliament, I pushed for the LIBE committee to look in depth at the current situation of media freedom in Europe. So protection of a journalist and as well the issue of hate speech and disinformation in this context. And in consequences, I became its special rapporteur on media freedom. It was also my intention to fit with this report as much as possible into European Democracy Action Plan, which was already mentioned, and in annual Rule of Law report and Digital Service Act. So my report got adopted with an overwhelming cross-party majority by the European Parliament, and we consider it as a very strong call for the European Parliament for an urgent need to support financially and legally independent media and journalists and strengthen our tools to fight disinformation and hate speech and the immense influence it has on our electoral process in the European Union. So allow me to only briefly focus on three things that I believe should really be
briefly, please.
Yes. So firstly, the urgent need for direct financial help for the independent journalists. So yesterday protests in silence could scream louder for it. And let me repeat what I said already many times. We cannot be short of money to defend democracy when there is a plenty of it to destroy it. So secondly, SLAPs, you also mentioned this problem. So as journalists and not only associations, you have been pushing for anti-Slav measures for already very long time. You have our full support in the European Parliament. I cannot stress enough how much we need also, as you right pointed out, in Poland, a comprehensive legislative proposal establishing standards, European standards against Slav practices across state countries. It seems that our united efforts has paid out, and we can expect soon proposals by Parliament. And thirdly, something also particularly dear to my heart, so media literacy. We cannot underestimate it. We need to strengthen education policies that promote media and information literacy. So media literacy is a crucial skill for modern citizens. So I know, I believe I was talking for quite a long time, and I would like, that you continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very, very useful for us all, and we wish you all the best. The report that you promoted, wrote, and had adopted was very, very good and very, very useful. Can I just move to Jamie now, who'll tell us, do you think the EU is doing enough?
Yeah, good question.
You don't have to answer the question.
I mean, I was going to speak a little bit about repolarization and deconcentration.
All right, go on, do that then.
Give a broader, and then maybe we can discuss recommendations at the end, which kind of conclude the report, just so we can stick on track. Yeah, thanks again for Magdalena for joining us. And yeah, I guess a lot of people will have seen yesterday that, yeah, a lot of news websites of media organizations in Poland went dark in protest of this new kind of advertising tax, but also about wider concerns about press freedom. And it was great to see that, yeah, that top European policymakers and officials were discussing it, were tweeting about it, and that the European Commission's spokesperson addressed it directly as well. But it's something that we've been seeing for a while. This was just really the tip of the iceberg of a long and quite sustained attempt by PS, the Law and Justice Party, over the last few years to kind of, yeah, to destabilize, weaken, and undermine in whatever forms they can the independent media in Poland. And yeah, I kind of want to just kind of step back a little bit from what we've heard so far and give a bit of a broader view on how this policy has been kind of developing and what its key points are. We were mentioned in the executive summary already, so I'll just kind of zoom in a little bit on repolarization and deconcentration. And as Scott said, these are kind of the centerpiece now of the model that PIS is adopting for kind of weakening critical media in the country. So this isn't something new. For many years now, PIS leaders and its allies in different political parties have kind of, have spread conspiracy theories and tried to kind of discredit and undermine foreign-owned media in Poland. Some of this is kind of US, other is German and Swiss. And for a long time, they've kind of propagated ideas that these newspapers are having a malign influence on Polish democracy and its electoral process. And using these arguments to then justify legislative changes that would limit the number of the power of foreign media or foreign investors in the Polish market. So just really briefly to explain, repolarization is a kind of an idea that's been battered around for a long time now. It hasn't, no bill has been produced and brought to Parliament, but the idea basically would be to limit the kind of the amount of foreign-owned capital to between 15 and 30% in the Polish media market. And this would largely affect a couple of key critical and larger liberal outlets, particularly Axel Springer, which owns Fact, Newsweek, and Onet, and then TVN24, which is owned by the US Discovery. And then in addition to that, there would be a supplementary bill on deconcentration. So the two kind of go together. And this one would limit the number of outlets that a single media group can own. So as Scott said, ostensibly this is being kind of argued around media pluralism, but in reality, it's about deconcentrating the market and repolarizing it in a way that's beneficial for the ruling party. And as I said, yeah, a long time rumors have swirled that this bill would be introduced. But what we heard during the mission was that, yeah, that for a long time, diplomatic pressure from key ally, the United States, but also from European states as well, paired with a wariness of Warsaw over basically an inevitable fight over EU law, had kind of, yeah, made the government think twice and kind of had to look for other options. We saw right after the mission ended, actually, that for the first time, it was revealed officially that legislation had been prepared, a bill had been drawn up, but that it hasn't been brought to Parliament yet. And again, we heard during the mission that it's perhaps just too politically and diplomatically difficult right now to bring forward this legislation. So what we've seen, really importantly, is instead, over the last few years, PIS has essentially had to look for alternatives. One for repolarization and another for deconcentration. Instead, it seems to have kind of, yeah, developed a strategy of a kind of scattered deconcentration. So while there's no piece of one legislation, they've used a kind of, yeah, an array of measures aimed at destabilizing those key titles I mentioned earlier. So this involves, yeah, kind of control over regulatory bodies, state advertising, and to some extent courts as well. So one example here is the regulator, the competition regulator, Hueting, which is currently, bringing forward a number of antitrust, unprecedented number of antitrust investigations into the market in Poland. At the same time, PIS control over state advertising from kind of state-owned companies and agencies is also being redirected away from independent media to pro-government media, which is slowly distorting the media market there. So yeah, all of these kind of things together, the idea is about adding as much pressure, both financial and administrative, to these independent titles as possible, weakening their position in the market as much as possible, and making sure that, yeah, the financially they're in a weakest position as they can be, which of course has been exacerbated by COVID-19 and making, advertising extremely difficult right now. And then, yeah, as I said, there's kind of, with the absence of repolarization legislation, PIS has had to adopt a different model, basically. And this, there was attempts made in the beginning to kind of copy the Hungary model, which over a number of years kind of forced out foreign publishers and owners, predominantly German and Swiss, which were then taken over by pro-Hungarian, pro-government media companies and allies and oligarchs of the Fidesz government there. But in Poland, because of the kind of development of the country after independence, the system is not quite the same. There's not so many oligarchs and allies that PIS can rely upon to kind of act as the pockets of the state. So instead, they had to find a different way. And as Magdalena indicated earlier and Scott mentioned, this model is something really quite unprecedented and unique within the European Union. And it's a model that basically, sorry, that's my place.
Are you going to stop now, Jamie?
I can stop and hand over, yeah, but just to end, I can say basically that what we've seen, and this is noted in the report, is that Poland is kind of taking quite worrying steps down the path that was forged by Hungary. And it's kind of done quite a calculated cherry-picking exercise where the bits that worked in Hungary have been adopted and copied in Poland, and bits that haven't worked, the government has kind of slowly found workarounds. And instead it's using these state-owned companies instead of oligarchs. So the model is a little bit different, but the end result is essentially the same, which means, yeah, the undermining and the capture essentially of titles that air and broadcast voices that are critical of the government. So this is something we're really concerned about, not just in Poland and Hungary, but we've seen it also being exported to other states within Europe and in the European Union as well. Again, with concerning implications for media pluralism, independence, and freedom.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we could move to Witold Głowacki now, who is a respected commentator on the Polska The Times, which is the sort of flagship newspaper of the Polska press group, which is about to be taken over, or is being taken over at the moment by Orlen, the petrol giant. And Mr. Głowacki, maybe you could tell us what you think the future for your newspapers, what lies in the future for your newspapers, please.
Of course, maybe a few words about the situation in our publishing group. Thank you for your attention and support. My name is Witold Głowacki. I am editor and journalist in Polska Times, one of daily newspapers published by Polska Press Group. This company is owning about 20 of regional daily papers and a lot of local weeklies and web portals and web pages in Poland. It's a large media company. For Polska Press are working about 2,000 of journalists. Now there is in progress a process of acquisition of Polska Press by Orlen. It's a big oil and fuel company owned by the state and controlled by politicians of ruling party Law and Justice. By the years, this company was completely not interested in media till today, of course. To be clear, economical power of Orlen is used to realize political idea of repolonization and deconcentration media in Poland. Repolonization and deconcentration, translated from political language means nationalization and some form of control by government, I think. Orlen wants to finish the transaction till the end of this month. And for us, journalists and of Polska Press, this is our small part of this much bigger problem with media freedom in Poland, and a source of concerns. Till today, there was only one example of taking the media by current ruling camp in Poland. It happened in Polish public media, public TV, and public radio. It was 5 years ago, and it was very fast and very brutal way to change this media into the propaganda outlet, propaganda factory working for a ruling party. Some part of our concerns are linked with it. This scenario, this model from taking the public media could be repeated. And this way means for us purge and mass firing. And for my colleagues in smaller than Warsaw cities, in smaller possibilities of finding new employment in media, it's a horrible perspective. But yes, part of us is expecting a short transition period and then the carnage in the style of peace taking over TVP in 5 years ago. But some other part of our concerns are linked with more soft way of the political acquisition of our media. Not purge, but rather silent political pressure, some kind of censoring and auto-censoring, self-censoring, some slow but consequent changes of our media profiles to use them in political interest of the ruling party. It could be combined with some kind of economical pressure for journalists and other forms of pressure to execute it and make it effective in the term of in perspective of next elections in Poland and local elections in 3 years, which is very important in Polish political system to taking and to taking the power and in this country. And yes, there is a possibility like this, then that it will be a soft kind of political pressure by a year or two, or by a few months, or a little bit more, and then next step and using this media to political interest in the hard scale, in this full scale way. Of course, there is theoretically is also third possibility, normal way for our working and developing our media. But there is no any guarantee for it, except of the declarations, some few words of new owner. To be honest, till now, completely nothing happened. Our work looks absolutely normal, like month, 3 months, or year before. But as I said, there is no any guarantee for future. In Poland, there is no regulations for situation like this. We have a law about public media. The law is dead for now, and it's fiction. But there is a law about public media, about its independence of journalists in public media, and some other things like this. There is no law for other media companies of other media outlets owned by the state. It's simple to explain this state. In Poland, there wasn't till now that kind of media owning. There was one exception. Daily Rzeczpospolita was partially owned by the state, but it was a minority in owning, and it was a long and concerning problem in our history. But about 10 years ago, it was privatized, and now it's private media publishing company, and there is no any law for situation like Polska Press, for situation like media owned by the state, other media than public media, and now it's starting a very risky and dangerous experiment without any earlier experiences with it. And we are inside of it, and this is our problem. This is a specter of our concerns in this moment. I think it was these few words about our concerns and our future. And
okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to say that at the Society of Journalists, we're planning to monitor what is happening in Polska Press newspapers. We're just gearing up, but the problem is, as you say, nothing is happening at the moment, so there's not much to monitor. But we're on to this, and we invite you to work with us if you feel the need. I just wanted to ask Dominika Bychawska just very quickly: is it true that there is a press law which was written in 1984, which I never took seriously actually, but there is a press law which people seem to take? People talk about it. Could you just briefly say?
Yes, we have a press law from 1984, and obviously many institutions of that press law is not adapted to the current situation, mostly to digital media. And this law is in this law we find a lot of criminal responsibility around journalists. So it has also very, let's say, awkward institutions like the authorization of interviews that has been recently changed based on the ruling of the European Court of Human Rights. But also at one point, this law has been used and some provision of that law that we barely knew that existed before started to be used against journalists. And for instance, I'm thinking here about a case of a Newsweek journalist and a prosecution opened based on the fact that he has more or less revealed the roundabouts of a certain constitutional court judge in one of his articles. So we never thought that revealing roundabouts was something that could be pursued criminally. But yes, these are institutions that are in our press law and that are being used. On
All
the
right.
other hand, we have a very powerful, sorry, if I may take a small second, a powerful institution in the press law saying that press debate and press freedom should not be entailed and limited by, the press critics should not be limited by officials. And each and every journalist, media outlet could use these institutions against governmental officials that are trying to limit their critics.
Has anyone tried to use it?
Yes, and unfortunately,
happened?
using it means that prosecution will not be open. So the prosecution authorities refuse to use this article. And we have been trying and attempting to use it, especially in cases of the participation of journalists in demonstrations, and the fact that based on COVID regulation that has been pushed back from the demonstration and unable to continue to monitor and write and inform about a certain demonstration. For
Okay,
instance.
Dominika, thank you very much. Now, Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Thanks,
We have
Krzysztof.
3 questions, I think, at the moment. Go ahead.
Thanks, Krzysztof. I'll try to keep it short because we're already running over a bit, and indeed there's already some questions. I'll present the mission's findings on physical attacks and safety of journalists, focusing in particular on protests, which featured prominently in many of our conversations, unsurprisingly. Unsurprisingly, first, because there was a lot of protest in Poland last year. Secondly, unsurprising because these rallies came with, as Scott also mentioned in his overview of the key findings, an increased level of violence against journalists and media workers who were covering them, including violence coming from law enforcement officers. Before looking in more detail at some of the incidents, a quick look at international law and standards on the issue. Last summer, the UN Human Rights Committee adopted a general comment on the right to peaceful assembly, and in it, they noted the role of journalists and others who report on assemblies as being of particular importance for the full enjoyment of that right, and also stating that law enforcement officials must protect journalists from harm. In a nutshell, the basic approach should be to seek to facilitate coverage of assemblies. In Europe, looking at the Strasbourg court, it's also confirmed that the gathering of information is an essential preparatory step in journalism, inherently protected as a part of press freedom. In short, then, really, the violence against journalists and media workers is unacceptable, and they have the right to gather information, and law enforcement should protect them from illegal interference with that, especially at demonstrations. Looking at some illustrations, then, what happened in Poland instead. On a number of occasions last year, we saw that journalists and media workers faced violence from protesters against which there was no adequate police protection. For instance, on the 23rd of October, 2 reporters for Gazeta Wyborcza sustained injury when they were attacked by a group of about 30 hooligans who were intimidating protesters during a Women's March. In addition to violence emanating from protesters, as mentioned, there's been a number of very serious incidents of intimidation and violence by the police themselves against journalists and media workers who were covering these protests. A very particularly concerning case of intimidation because of its targeted nature also was when on the 23rd of November, police arrested Agata Grybowska, award-winning photojournalist. She was documenting a protest in Warsaw and was detained for several hours for allegedly violating the physical integrity of a police officer, after which she was released without charge. Another example, on the 11th of November, during the Independence March in Warsaw that was organized by nationalist and far-right groups, several journalists and reporters were injured by the police, caught up in clashes between protesters and police near the station. For instance, journalists rather were beaten by the police with batons, even though they were wearing very bright press insignia. Others were pepper sprayed. During the same protest, also in an image that really was quite a shock to see, a 74-year-old photojournalist, Thomas Guthrie, was shot in the face with a rubber bullet from 10 meters away, and he required surgery to have the bullet removed. Now, a very small minority of the mission's interlocutors said that this type of incident is unavoidable during large-scale protests, or they went as far as to blame the media themselves, saying too many reporters blurred the lines between observation and participation. Frankly, we find these arguments really hard to buy when most of the media workers who were attacked were clearly identifiable as members of the press and were obviously doing their job. These acts of violence must be investigated, of course, leading to those responsible being held to account. So far, there's been a really marked absence of this accountability. There's also clear need going forward to change law enforcement's approach to policing these kinds of protests in line with international law and standards, so that journalists and media workers can be protected when they cover demonstrations. If I can have one more minute, Krzysztof?
Yes, just one.
Yes. Outside of protests, there's also been attacks on journalists. An example, in October, a camera operator of a regional branch of the public television broadcaster was attacked and beaten while he was covering the arrest of a businessman. This increase in violence needs to be seen against the background of deepening polarization that was mentioned before, translating into violence and also increased threats, smears, harassment, online and offline. And to raise just one more example, Adam Michnik, the editor-in-chief of Gazeta Wyborcza, has been facing waves of harassment egged on by politicians in part. Back in March, for instance, an MEP for the Law and Justice Party, Dominik Bychawska, posted a video to Twitter of himself harassing Michnik on the train after accidentally running into him. As an attack on media freedom, these incidents, of course, don't reach the level of seriousness as the previously raised examples of physical violence. But I think it really speaks volumes to politicians' responsibility in creating and deepening these kinds of societal divisions that underlie them, and linking it back, Krzysztof, to your opening remarks. I will stop here. The list goes on and on.
Thank you very much. Just on this case of Mr. Guthrie, who was shot in the cheek by a rubber bullet. Actually, that was a mistake by the police because he was a photographer for a pro-government newspaper, and that was the only case where they apologized and said they were sorry. But in the other cases, they don't really apologize. Jamie, this question from, I'm going to questions now. This question from Dorota Nigran, you didn't mention Polish radio. Is this because you feel things are okay at Polish radio?
It wasn't because of that. I think we included TVP in those recommendations because, yeah, during the report we saw the kind of the loss of independence at the TV the public broadcaster was most extreme and most stark. And during the recent presidential election, the effects of this were felt very strongly. I think IPI kind of looked at this issue at the time, and even more than before, the TV public broadcaster was, yeah, basically acting as a mouthpiece of the ruling party and a means of personal communication, which was having a kind of a disproportionate effect on the election and communication, equal access to information. So that was why we included it there. In addition to, I think in recent years, the TV public broadcast in particular has become a kind of a means of smearing and attacking critics of the government as well, which we haven't seen quite so much in the radio. So I think that was why we really focused on TVP in the recommendations. But I think obviously, yeah, a restoration of independence at all elements of the public broadcaster would be a really essential part of reform moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, we have a question from someone called Ginko K, asking what can journalists abroad do to help? Maybe Scott or Jamie?
Sure. I mean, I think maybe we can take this question as an opportunity to speak a little bit about the recommendations of the report. So I encourage everyone to download and read the report, which is really an excellent summary of the issues. It's available in both English and Polish. I know that we're a little bit over time. So just wanted to mention that again. And the report contains a number of recommendations, and I do think that there is a need for strong international pressure on this issue, on media freedom in Poland. And I think it's, in particular, we need a very strong recognition from the European Union, from other governments, about the methods, about the illiberal methods being used in Poland to distort the media market in favor of building up, in favor of weakening critical media and building up pro-government media that parrot the government or that serve as government mouthpieces. Again, we really have missed this in Hungary, a strong reaction to these methods, and they are now spreading. And we really need a strong and united front from the EU to push back against these efforts. And I think, the question has come up several times during this discussion: is the EU doing enough? And I think it clearly isn't. And I think that we also need to push back against any narrative that the EU doesn't have competencies to work on many of these issues, because it simply isn't true. And I think if you look at the way that, again, if you look at these exact methods, many of them are ways of not just repressing media freedom, but also distorting the market and preserving, a fair market as one of the core competencies of the European Union. If you look at the way that state-owned companies in Poland are distorting advertising and using that to weaken critical media, if you look at the way that even the government itself around some of the COVID ads, Gazeta Wyborcza was deprived of being part of an ad campaign around COVID completely. If you look at, even the involvement of a state-owned or state-controlled energy company as an owner in the media market is extremely troubling and disturbing, and doesn't really have a place in the European Union. And even the entire concept of repolonization, deconcentrations are methods of interfering with the market, of blocking investments of foreign media companies in Poland, and breaking the rules of the internal market. These are all issues that can be dealt with by the European Union, and these are the levers that are being used, and also government control over regulatory bodies. These are all areas where we need more intervention from Brussels, and we need a stronger front to say that what is happening in Poland, what is happening in Hungary, this illiberal approach doesn't have a place in the EU. And I think that we just haven't seen a strong enough pushback yet. And the proof of that is that this effort is just accelerating. Over the past few months, these problems have just grown even since we carried out these interviews in November. So it's really time for a much stronger pushback. So that's just a little bit, I think from my side in terms of the recommendations.
Thank you. And we have a last question about is the government using social media in the kind of Trump way to neutralize independent and professional media? Not really. Who'd like to answer that?
I can.
Or maybe Witold Głowacki. Please go ahead.
Yes, in Poland, our country is in avant-garde of using social media as a political technique and some kind of political and it started a few years ago before the first election, which was won by Law and Justice, and ruling party using this kind of internet things and trolls and a lot of profiles which are which working for the interest of ruling party in internet, and a lot of it is used to neutralize professional and independent media in Poland by some other methods, campaigns of hate and defamation of some titles. I think the most hated by ruling camp and its supporters in social media are the media like Wyborcza, like TV TVN, like Gazeta Wyborcza, like Onet, like and sometimes our media from Polska Press.
Okay.
Can I take
yes.
the floor for a minute?
Yes, please, because we're running out of time, but please go
yes,
ahead.
okay, so I fully agree that the European Union doesn't do enough to defend democracy. And as I said, we already crossed the limit beyond which our helplessness becomes humiliation. But let me say what can we do? So the first one is pressure. So as much pressure as possible from all sides, from every institution that is orientated to defend democracy. The second one, legislative changes that I demand in my report for the European Parliament. And the third one, it's financial measures. So both financial support for independent journalists and financial restriction for governments that use our European money to destroy democracy and that use, state citizens' money to support the propaganda state media. So this, I think, are the very important three actions that we can do and we should do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't see any more hands. So what I'm going to say is thank you very much to the authors of this report and the people who put it together. And I'd just like to say just a couple of things. One is that we have to remember now that we've gone into a period of factional inter-party strife inside the law and justice movement. There's a law and justice, which is the mainstream, and then there is a group on the right, a hardline group, and then there's a more moderate group on the left. And if you look at the public media, which is a bit of a strain, but sometimes it's worth looking at it, you'll find that the public media discriminate against one wing or the other wing. It's not just that they are now discriminating against all of us, it's now they're discriminating inside their party. At the moment, for instance, the moderate people aren't being invited to programs on the public media because they're not happy about this advertising business. The hardline people weren't being invited a few weeks ago, and this plays into the whole business of Polska Press and the local media. It's a very, very complicated thing that's happening here because that media will have to be divided up amongst the various factions inside Law and Justice. I mean, we're in stage 2 of the revolution. You remember when Danton had his head cut off? That's what's happening now. They are fighting amongst themselves. And therefore, the whole media, this is why this media, impartial media is so important, so that everyone gets a fair say. At the moment, the politicians inside the ruling group aren't getting a fair say. The other thing, finally, I wanted to say is about Polska Press is that PKN Orlen is 1% owned by the Norwegian Investment Fund, which you remember is this massive, great fund which invests in companies all around the world. It also has this reputation that it is fair and proper and doesn't do harm to the world, etc. It's 1% of the shares, but for some reason, which I don't understand, they have 10% of the voting rights at the annual meeting. The problem with Orlen is that they have a very passive supervisory council. All the companies which are shareholders in Orlen are all somehow involved or reliant on the government, dependent on the government. The Norwegian fund is the only one which is completely independent. And at the I think that we should start, we should start planning or working to try and get the Norwegians to start talking about how this will affect media freedom, how this thing will defend media freedom, and whether Orlen should be doing what it's doing. It can buy the companies if it's a commercial decision, but it obviously isn't. So that's just one thing I just wanted to throw out there. So thank you very much to everyone. Is there anyone who wants to say something desperately? So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.